Very good. I'm ready.
The inside story on the issues that affect you and your community. This is Local 12 Newsmakers.
Good morning and welcome to Local 12 Newsmakers on the CW Cincinnati. Parliamentary systems, which dominate in democracies around the world, accommodate citizen movements by encouraging the formation of multiple parties. Governing coalitions have to be formed only after elections. In the United States, where a two-party system dominates our political life, parties are, in reality, coalitions of disparate groups formed prior to elections. Consequently, the origin of the terms such as the Big Tent. The success of movements that actually form third parties is measured in terms of their ability to force or persuade one of the dominant parties to alter its position and absorb the opposition movement, eliminating it as a threat that can deny the party victories. In the past year, the rise of a variety of disgruntled groups that have coalesced under the term Tea Party currently poses a challenge not just to the Obama-led Democratic Party, but also the opposition Republican Party. Last weekend, representatives of various Tea Parties from around the country met in Nashville, Tennessee. The 600 members who attended invited Sarah Palin to address the convention as its keynoter. At this point in its development, what are the goals and the plans of the local Tea Party and its leaders for 2010 and beyond? To discuss these issues, I am joined this morning by Mike Wilson, the founder of the Cincinnati Tea Party. Mr. Wilson grew up in Cincinnati and works as a manager in a local IT company. Mr. Wilson is running this fall for state legislator as a Republican in the 26th District, a seat currently held by Democrat Connie Pillock. And Christopher Littleton, the current president of the Cincinnati Tea Party. Mr. Littleton works in sales for a dental supply company. Welcome to Local 12 Newsmakers. Am I correct, 26th or 28th?
28th House District.
28th House. As soon as I said that, something didn't sound right to me. So anyway, welcome. On your website, you state that the Tea Party is, quote, a grassroots, nonpartisan organization of private citizens united by our shared values and opposed to wasteful government spending. Let's just begin. What are the shared values, Mike? What are those basic values?
Three very easy ones that we think resonate with the majority of Americans. Free markets, fiscal responsibility, and limited government. They were really chosen very specifically to unite fiscal conservatism, which I think still is an overwhelming majority of Americans, and deliberately to exclude social issues from the purvey of the Tea Party. Lots of people that are involved have very strong opinions on those issues, but for the purposes of what we're trying to accomplish, not relevant.
Okay, so that you're not trying to get a total platform that goes across all issues. You're really focused more on economic issues and government size, role of government. Those two things?
No, I think absolutely. And
okay.
If you look at the level of government spending, particularly at the federal level, it's really shot through the roof in the last 10 years. And the debt is really just out of control right now, and we're leaving a legacy for our children and our grandchildren that's just unacceptable, morally unacceptable.
Chris, what would be some of the specific things on this point about wasteful government spending, besides in general and the growing debt and all of that? What would be specific things that you would be, members of your party would be particularly concerned about?
Well, I mean, something as simple as we put it back in terms of your personal life all the time, or in terms of running a business all the time. I guess the basic expectation is common sense is what we want from the government. We hear sometimes that we're an anti-tax group. Well, we understand that taxation is something that's important and necessary to run a civil society. We acknowledge that. So we're not an anti-tax group as much. We are very much a common sense spending group. So let's only spend as much as that we're bringing in. Let's look at things in terms of balancing a budget would be something that's just kind of basically a start. Let's not overextend ourselves or build new programs.
In the current environment, what would you be opposed to, specifics?
As far as new programs that are coming out or existing ones?
Existing ones.
Yeah, we're probably a little bit more aggressive than some people, and I'd love to see not just entitlement reforms take place. We have to plan for a long-term future of which will be broken in the long term.
So entitlement reform, we're talking about Social Security, we're talking about Medicare. What would you see with Social Security? What's a way of, quote unquote, fixing that?
Sure. I guess this comes into, are we a solutions-based group, or are we a group that's sort of kind of shedding some extra light on the issues? We tend to shed a little bit more light on the issues as far as solutions. I can give you my personal opinion in that we have to look at the age at which Social Security is taken in, the amount of benefits that are out there, all of these kinds of things. I'm not saying deconstruct the entire Social Security system. I'm just saying we need to consider the long-term repercussions of debts that are outstanding. They're coming. They're going to grow larger and larger that we can't touch. I mean, we have no money coming into account for those things. So we have to have some sort of plan moving forward in order to reform those systems.
Mike?
Yeah, I think quite frankly, I mean, that which is not sustainable won't be sustained.
That's right.
One way or another, the amount that is outlaid for these particular programs is going to have to decrease, or taxes are going to have to go up significantly in order to do that. So we're going to be facing some very difficult decisions as a nation. So some of the things that we've really done here in the last few years, in terms of the stimulus funding, the TARP bailouts, and that kind of thing, have taken what is a long-term fiscal position that is unsustainable and then made it worse.
So with the stimulus, for example, let's take that. Do you believe the stimulus that the federal government simply should not have done anything like the stimulus?
I think we could have looked at a program of I know the thing that I think was most relevant there was actually a payroll tax cut, which would have, I think, done a lot to try to stimulate employment. But in all honesty, in a lot of those situations, what the government has done has actually made things more unstable. I think businesses are operating under what I call the uncertainty tax. They're looking at a future of increased taxation in order to pay for the programs that are underway right now. They looked at the possibility of cap and trade passing. They looked at the possibility of this attempt at healthcare reform passing as well, and looked at their future obligations going up.
So would you say that given the economic collapse that we were in 12 months ago, 18 months ago, for a 6-month period where the financial system was basically freezing up, what was the role of, what would you have said the role of the federal government was? Was it, what should it have done? Should it have done TARP at all? Should it allow the banks to collapse?
I think that we're in agreement that there's some justification for why we saw congressmen vote for TARP. We understand the urgency, we understand the need, the feel that something was going to happen. But obviously hindsight's 2020, and at the time I know my gut was definitely telling me this, and that is, at what point is government intervention too much? At what point are we choosing favorites in companies and banks and insurance companies and in the auto industry? And is that the proper role of government at all? I mean, I think that the question was far more fundamental than what came out in policy, which is, should we be that involved in private industry? Why are you too big to fail?
Is it that you simply don't believe the explanations out of both the last two administrations, by the way, not just the Obama administration, that to have done nothing would have resulted in more of a Great Depression situation? Is it that you just don't believe that, or you think that that would have been better anyway?
I think that there were imbalances, structural imbalances that have been built into the economy, particularly because of government intervention over historical terms here. We've reached a situation where, because of government intervention in the economy and essentially some of the regulations that have been placed on banks, we're in a situation that we've got banks that are really just too big to fail.
But that's not because of regulation. That's because of deregulation in 1999.
I would disagree with that completely.
Disagree as well.
Well, removing the Glass-Steagall Act is what changed the very structure of banking and allowed the creation of the kinds of things that have created the instruments that just collapsed, right? I mean, how is that not true?
I think there is a naive faith in regulations and the ability to do it. We're always fighting that last battle. We're always fighting the last war. And
could the flip side be there is a naive faith in the markets to self-regulate?
I don't think we really have free financial markets in a lot of those areas. The banks are among the most heavily regulated institutions in all of America. And obviously all of that regulation wasn't enough, to avoid that credit crisis that we faced back here in late 2008. Like I said, we do recognize that I think there was some justification on the part of congressmen in order to do something, but I think looking in retrospect, an orderly wind down of some of the failed banks would have been better than propping up failed institutions. Look at what happened in Japan during the 1990s is they looked at a whole bunch of bad banks and decided to essentially prop those up for the long term. In Japan, we call that the lost decade in Japan. I don't want a lost decade for America, and I think taking failed businesses and unwinding them properly according to the rules and bankruptcy proceedings that we have in place was the best thing for America, both in the short term and in the long term.
And second part of the show, we'll be talking about banking with bankers, so we'll see where they are. Okay, go ahead.
Absolutely.
I was going to say another really second practical example is something that also a lot of people don't know about is there was a giant drop in the market and a potential depression that took place prior to the Great Depression. It was just years ahead, and their answer to that was to deregulate a couple things, open up the marketplace, and allow the corrections to take place themselves. What we ended up seeing was what we now call the Roaring '20s. Now, there was some things that happened when market corrections took place again during the Great Depression where they said, we're going to go ahead and try and manage trade, we're going to try and alter the tax system, and it led to falling off the edge.
But as a historian, I have to say, you say market corrections as if that's just market corrections. But there are market corrections and there are market corrections. And the Great Depression, very few people at the time would have seen that as just, it was an excruciating market correction that drove 25% of people unemployment and even higher
but not initially it wasn't.
Not initially, but
correct. And 10 years prior to, that's what I was saying, 10 years prior to, we saw almost the same exact thing happen, whereas we didn't try and over-regulate the system and do a lot of government-forced intervention to fix the market.
Let me move on to one other topic because I'm aware of time, and that is the healthcare question, because that certainly has generated a lot of the concern of people who identify with the movement that the two of you are part of. What do you see as the question with healthcare? Are you concerned about the issues that were trying to be addressed, the 30 million people who aren't insured? And secondly, do you believe that states, the experiments in Massachusetts and Hawaii and several other states, are those things that you would support on a state level, but just not a federal level?
In the end, anytime you give somebody essentially a blank checkbook in order to have as much care as they want, Massachusetts is an example. They moved to what was essentially the public option, and essentially state-run care there. And what we saw were costs just literally explode out of control. The premise that what we're proposing before Congress right now is as a cost-saving measure, I find ludicrous. Every single time that this has been tried through the history of the United States, whether it's at the state level or even other countries that have tried this at the government level, they've seen costs explode out of control. And in the end, because we're not using the price system in order to ration care, they end up having government force rationing down our throats. I think it's a logical consequence of the policies that are being pursued. So it's really just a policy question of what your preference is.
What's the price control situation that you would try to put into the system?
I'd like to see the market have more to do with it. Again, we have a government intervention where wage controls led to businesses all of a sudden purchasing healthcare insurance for their
We spend
employees.
about 50 to 70% more than any other country per capita on healthcare with mediocre results. We're about middle of the pack of industrialized countries. So, we do spend a lot of money on healthcare.
No, we absolutely do, okay? And I would take issue with some of the statistics that are put out by the UN or the OECD regarding healthcare. I think there's been a lot that has been done in order to essentially debunk some of that stuff. Quite frankly, things that rank us much lower than some of those other countries are ridiculous.
Child mortality.
There's a reason why people from all around the world, okay, particularly the elite and well-off, come to the United States in order to receive the best care in the world.
Okay. Any last thought on healthcare?
Yeah, I guess I try and go back to these common sense solutions all the time, and I look at what we've seen happen in Europe. That's the easiest way to think about this. We look at what's happening in Europe, and what do we see happening in Europe right now? They can't afford the current system, so they're coming back to something that either one, a little bit more privatization, or a reduction in benefits. They have to.
I'm aware that I'm over time, but I have one more question.
Sure.
What's your relationship to the existing, locally now, Republican and Democratic parties?
I'll let you take that one.
Sure. There is very little of a relationship with either one. Not strained in any way, just no particular relationship.
Because you've tried and there hasn't been any?
Reached out to the Democratic Party a couple times with no response.
And what about the Republican Party, where you would have more ideological alliance?
Sure. Have had conversations with them, very friendly. But apart from that, there's no specific relationship to speak of.
Okay. Well, from my perspective as a candidate, I find it interesting because I've got a lot of people that are coming to me, wanting meetings, and I think they're looking to and kind of angling for endorsements in their race. Yet I end up with a primary myself in my particular race. So I think to an extent they're welcoming, but also at the same time a little nervous because we're people that previously weren't engaged in the process.
Which goes back to my introduction about the nature of American parties. So,
True.
thank you
true.
very much for being here. You'll be back. You'll certainly be back as time moves on here. And if you want more information about the Cincinnati Tea Party, check out their website at cincinnatiteaparty.org. Stay tuned. During the State of the Union, President Obama called for steps to strengthen community banks. After the break, I'll be joined by representatives of the local Community Bank Trading Association. Thank you. Welcome back. Over the last 2 years, we have heard a great deal about the problems of huge banks, some described as too big to fail. As is the case with many aspects of the modern economy, recent history has been characterized by tremendous consolidation in the financial sector. 50 years ago, Cincinnati was served by dozens of local banks and literally hundreds of savings and loans. Although the headlines are filled with news about the problems of giant national banks, community banks still exist. And comparatively, they have weathered the economic storm fairly well. And more importantly, their role in the recovery as lenders to small businesses, the primary generator of jobs, has been increasingly recognized. These community-based institutions, community banks, savings banks, building and loan companies, are represented by the Tri-State League of Financial Institutions. The league was formed in 1960 by a merger of the Greater Cincinnati Savings and Loan Exchange and the Greater Hamilton County Savings and Loan League. To discuss the role of community-based financial institutions in our area, I am joined this morning by Annie Iverson, the president of the Tri-State League of Financial Institutions. Ms. Iverson works as the marketing director for Cheviot Savings Bank, and Tom Siemers, the president emeritus of the league and a longtime president of Franklin Savings. Welcome to Newsmakers. This is
good to be here.
Yeah, it's really good, Tom, to have you here. You are an icon in this whole field. What's the difference between community bank these days, savings banks, savings and loans? Are these terms interchangeable from the consumer's point of view? You know, does it make any difference if it's a savings bank or a savings and loan, or no?
I think you can get most of the same services that the average citizen needs or uses at any of those institutions.
Okay. Well, what about the difference besides just size? Obviously, Franklin Savings is not as big as Citibank. What's the difference, though, in what they can do between what we call community banks and these huge institutions? Is there some functional difference here?
Well, one of the big major differences is you can actually walk in and talk to someone at our bank. You're not a number, you're not, just anybody coming in. You can actually sit down, you can talk with someone. And usually it's some of these big banks, once you do a loan, they're gone. They're.
Well, isn't one of the things we've learned, literally the loan's gone. It's sold.
It is sold.
And they're no longer, the people you were dealing with to get the loan are no longer involved with the loan. I mean, that's another thing I think we've learned in the last couple of years. Is it that those large banks actually can do things that, in terms of trading in investments, that community banks don't do at all?
Well, I think that's true. The large banks have a lot more capacity and so forth, but with the things that Joe Lunchbucket needs and uses, they can get the same products and services at our savings and loan or at one of our competitor banks like Fifth Third or so forth. There's no question about that. And I think with the loans, as you say, the big banks or so forth, but we can do in the ordinary everyday things, whatever Fifth Third or U.S. Bank or any of the big guys can do.
There's a lot of interest in community banks, and I was referencing it before. President Obama in his State of the Union talked about the need for community banks to be active and make loans to small businesses because you're close to small businesses. That's easier said than done, though, right? In the current environment, what's the situation that your banks, your types of banks, face in terms of stepping up loan activity?
Well, I think it got a lot to do with the regulations. You know, we have to do what we're allowed to do. So I think that plays a big part in it.
And are those do you find those regulations problematic? And there's a lot of discussion about revising banking regulations right now.
Yes, I mean, they've gotten tougher, which, you know, shouldn't necessarily be for the community banks because we've done the safer lending. We didn't do the subprime lending that some of the big banks did.
Have any of the community banks in our area, in the tri-state region, have any of them been forced out of business because of getting themselves into trouble with subprime?
Oh yeah,
There have
several.
been some.
And you know, I think that what I've always said is, and I feel it strongly, that if we are competitive in price and service with the big guys, we will get our share of the business. And I think that's true. This year, last year, 09, we did 4 to 5 times what we did in 08 in the way of lending. And all you hear about is lending is depressed and small people can't get loans. From our standpoint, I have to dispute that.
So you're saying that at Franklin, your institution, you were doing 4 to 5 times the business?
That's
as
right.
The year before in 09?
In 09,
Really?
in 09 than we did in 08. Yes.
What about at Cheviot?
Yeah, us as well. I mean, we had more, and I think a lot of people have realized that, you know, they want to do business with a community bank.
So some of that is not just because you're competitive, but also because people maybe are shying away from some of the banks that have gotten themselves in trouble.
Yes.
They want to turn to community banks. You know, on this question of regulation, there was a letter that was published in late October by Barney Frank, who chairs the, written by Barney Frank, who chairs the Banking Financial Services Committee in the House of Representatives, warning regulators not to be, you know, in this environment where everybody's concerned about banks, not to be putting the screws so tightly on the community banks that we end up creating another problem. I found this a very interesting letter. Is your reaction that at least in the case of Barney Frank, you got somebody you can talk to about this sort of stuff? Or not?
I think generally Barney Frank was not a name that local people or a person that local people look to as the epitome of a Washingtonian. But in his letter, he's right on. Examination, the supervisory process has become very subjective with the people in the field. The regulations, the rules, the laws don't mean as much to these folks as it used to. They interpret it the way they want. And Barney Frank, in his letter, he hit the nail on the head in several points. That's exactly what they do. And everything seems to boil down to asset quality. And with the prices of real estate, which is our major business, and the economy and the unemployment, it's difficult. And they've got a tough job to handle, they really do.
Right. In the case of the institutions that are part of the Tri-State League, Annie, is it mostly making home loans, or a lot of these are business loans, right? I mean, there's also businesses coming to you for loans as well.
Yeah.
So what's that mix, and has that mix changed over the years? I mean, savings and loans originally were really focused on home loans, but with this new structure, community banks, the savings banks, it's a broader lending pool, right?
Yes.
You're looking at different business.
Yes, we do business loans as well as mortgage loans for home loans. So,
And what would you say, and we've got only about a minute left, what would you say is important? What's the role that community banks are going to play, say, over the next 1 or 2 years in helping us out of this economic mess that we're in? Annie?
I think a big part of it is being involved in our communities. I mean, all of us that are involved in the Tri-State League, we all reinvest into the communities that we basically do business in. So I think that's a huge thing for people who live in these communities.
Tom, what do you think?
I always say I have great faith in the American people. I was a little surprised in the last election about the greatness of the American people, and I don't want to get into that. But I think the American people will come through this with flying colors, and we'll eventually get back to where we were.
Very good. If people would like to learn more about the Tri-State League of Financial Institutions, check out their website at tristateleague.com. Thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you for making Newsmakers a part of your Sunday morning. Join us again next week to meet the men and the women working and investing to shape our community for the future. Have a good week.